Hello, my name's Jan Wood. Welcome to today's episode of Coffee Break. And today our special topic is International Women's Day. Now, International Women's Day to me is a very important day. It's a day that women all around the world celebrate on the 8th of March to honour the work of women who work tirelessly around issues pertaining to equal pay for equal work, all things to do with women's lives. Now, the first International Women's Day rally took place in 1910. So in 2012, this is our 102nd celebration. And this year in Sydney, there will be a picnic at First Fleet Park. Now, this is the first time in many years that there is not a celebratory march through the streets of inner Sydney. So that's sad. But then on the other hand, it's still a wonderful way to celebrate women's achievements and the women that have done so much. So if you're celebrating International Women's Day, it's traditional to wear purple or green or white or a combination of these. And these have been the colours in the march and rally right from the very beginning. So today I would like to honour 5 women who worked tirelessly against injustice. Now, our first person is Joyce Stevens, and I'm a great fan of hers. She spent a lifetime working in feminist circles, and her passion was documenting, and she wrote quite a few little books. So one of Joyce's books is this one, A History of International Women's Day in Words and Images. And it's all about the different marches that have occurred over the years. So in 2006, I went and I interviewed Joyce about her work and her documentation. So now we'll cut to a little bit of footage of the wonderful Joyce Stevens.
Well, taking the revolution home was an attempt on my part to raise the profile of the women in the Communist Party, who were often only seen as people who raised money for good causes or, supported their men if they were out on strike and stuff like that. So that was my main aim. The other one was to inform some of the younger feminists that there had been, all sorts of women's organisations prior to the women's liberation movement, and that while you might disagree perhaps with some of their aims or what they did, they were very political and active women. I mean, some of those women who were miners' wives, they were fabulous women, They did amazing things. And if it hadn't been for the women, many of the strikes of those militant miners would never have succeeded, I think there's always been some women who stood out of the crowd, and some women who always valued some form of organisation of women, even if it was at afternoon tea parties where women got together and talked about their families and their problems and the school and how the kids were going at school and stuff like that, which is sort of stuff that people might look down their nose at, but at a certain period in Australia it was very valuable forms of organisation and activity amongst women, because Australia hasn't always been like it is now, or it was 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, the amount of communication between people now is so extraordinary compared to, say, before the Second World War, back in the 30s, when lots of people were unemployed, when lots of people had very poor living standards, and people didn't really know what this group or that group was doing. And so those first women's organisations, especially amongst the miners and on the railway women had auxiliaries as well, and the miners had auxiliaries. And that established a communication amongst women that was enormously important to their lives.
Now, another woman that I am full of admiration for is our Eva Cox. And Eva, at the end of the 1990s, wrote this book, Leading Women, where she was trying to work out what made a leader and why there were so few female leaders. And in 1995, in a Boyer lecture, feminist Eva Cox explored her ideas for creating a truly civil society. Now, in Leading Women, Eva challenges all Australian women and men who are dissatisfied with their present leaders to initiate change and become leaders themselves. And I was very honoured to be acknowledged as a woman of leadership in Eva's book.
I mean, yes, it's one of the arguments that I sort of tend to get into about that. I think, obviously people need to work at the local level. Obviously people need to fix things at the local level. When I said in the USA to people that from the outside it looked as though the USA was falling apart, and they said, yes, well, it was. That it's actually losing things, you're getting no-go areas, you're getting serious problems, crime rates, whatever it is. And I said, what are you doing about it? Oh, they say, I'm doing some volunteer work down at the local centre. And you say, well, what are you doing about changing the broad things? Oh, that's too hard. I think we have to do things about the big structures as well as the little structures, because the big structures are affecting what happens at the local level. And it doesn't mean that you don't work at the local level, it doesn't mean you're affected at the local level, but if they screw up your pensions and if they screw up the economy in a big way, and if they sell off things and cut down on the public sector and cut down on the health services and the other sorts of services, it's going to be hell at the local level. Yeah, you need I'm not saying you don't need the groundswell of support, but you don't start at the bottom and work your way up to the top. A lot of women start at the local level, and a lot of women get stuck at the local level. They don't get past the system. While they're busy doing local politics and building up a real network in there, there's some blokes in at head office sort of crawling up the arses of the various factions, excuse the term, and guess who gets the positions of power? Guess who gets into cabinet? Guess who gets those things there? We've had recent examples in New South Wales, and I just think it is really important that if we are going to get any sort of change in the process, that we actually make sure that we have a lot of women in the system. I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote Leading Women. There's a whole lot of stuff in that.
But don't they cut their teeth at the local level?
No, they stay there. They lose their bloody teeth at the local level in some cases.
That's true.
And I mean, the idea that this is a rational system, that, when you proved yourself at the local level, some bloke, let's face it, from head office will say, oh, what a good local candidate, they should go to the state or federal level. Guess what? It does not happen.
My name's Jan Wood and you're watching Coffee Break, and today our special topic is women who made it happen. Women who are leaders in the community and women who have spent their lives working in the name of justice. Now, going back to Joyce Stevens' book, Taking the Revolution Home, the last half of the book is honouring women that devoted their lives to the movement, the women's movement. And one of the women that she honoured is Edna Ryan. Now, here's a little bit of preface about Edna Ryan. Edna Ryan was born in 1904, and I'll just read a little bit here about what Joyce Stevens has written about Edna Ryan. Born in 1904. Influenced by the industrial workers of the world, the political ferment during the First World War, and the Russian Revolution, Edna Ryan joined the militant women's movement and then the Communist Party in 1927. She organised CPA party lectures and spoke at Hall and Street meetings. She became deeply involved in the campaign of support for the 1929 timber worker strike and remembers the very first International Women's Day rally in Sydney in 1928. And I'll just read a little bit here about what Joyce Stevens has written about Edna Ryan. born in 1904. Influenced by the industrial workers of the world, the political ferment during the First World War and the Russian Revolution, Edna Ryan joined the militant women's movement and then the Communist Party in 1927. She organised CPA party lectures and spoke at Hall and Street meetings. She became deeply involved in the campaign of support for the 1929 timber worker strike and remembers the very first International Women's Day rally in Sydney in 1928. Edna didn't live to be 100, but on her 100th birthday, her family and friends gathered together to honour her life's work. So now we'll cut to Eva Cox, and she's going to explain a bit of background about Edna Ryan.
I've got a photo of the strip
It's obviously from the same batch.
I've been trying to work out how to describe Edna for most.
I forgot to say, this is Eva Cox.
We know.
Yeah. I was her patrol leader in the Guides.
I can't quite remember that. I can remember we were both in Guides together. I was the first lieutenant, there we are. When I was 12, I used to go round to the Ryans on a Friday night when they were still living in Wallara, behind the butcher shop, and we'd have dinner, and it opened my eyes to politics. I've never actually sat through so many sort of rapid political things. It was 1950-51. It was a time of the political, the communist referendum. There was a whole lot of discussions about whether or not you burnt your documents in the backyard. There were lots of discussions about the whole political situation, and I was just sort of bug-eyed and bug-eared about the whole thing. And Julia and I would trot off to Girl Guides arguing about Khrushchev and Stalin and various other sorts of things. I'm not quite sure how that went with Girl Guides. Anyhow, I stayed knowing the Ryans, but not particularly close. And Julia and I were quite close at university when we were both involved in setting up the ALP club. So that my sort of political growth was sort of partly was connected with the sort of the Ryan family. And then many years later, when I turned up in Women's Electoral Lobby, who should be there but Edna? So in a sense, she has always been part of my sort of political activism. And I've been very conscious of the fact that she has been part of it because, one of the things that Edna taught me a whole lot of things. One thing is she taught me you could never actually say no about things political. You just got off your butt and did it. Otherwise she'd be on the other end of the phone complaining bitterly about the fact you weren't doing it. The other thing is I was in the Labour Party for a while. She introduced me to being a non-factional person in the Labour Party, which was an extraordinarily uncomfortable position to be in the Labour Party. I didn't, yes. I copped a lot of shit for that various thing, but I thought, okay, if Edna can do it, I can do it. So I lasted 17 years in the Labour Party as a non-factional person before I finally sort of got out of it. But she taught a lot of lessons to a lot of us politically. She was very active when she lived in Glebe. She used to be onto the phone to me and everybody else about sort of getting out and doing things. So I think I owe her a huge debt. I think the women's movement owes her a huge debt, which goes well beyond the second wave when she was first fighting for equal pay. As Patrick says, her indignation about what happened to her sisters and her mother really fed into her total views about what her role was. And she taught me also pragmatism, which I think is one of the lessons which is very useful. Edna didn't have much time for ideological battles or particular sort of personal things about this, that or the other. I'd say, oh, but I don't like the way this person deals with this, that and the other. She said, oh, forget all that sort of rubbish. If they're useful, get in there and use them and do it. So I think she had an enormous influence on a lot of people, both in labour circles and in the women's movement, and I still feel I owe her a huge debt. And it's really nice being here and being able to at least say that. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Joan Wood and you're watching Coffee Break. And today I'm honouring people who've made a special contribution to the women's movement. And one of our absolute darlings is Faith Bandler. And I have a little bit of footage here from a Jessie Street National Women's Library luncheon where she's talking about her and Jessie Street's work in recognising Aboriginal people and the Constitution. Now, the story that she's about to tell is about Ray. There was an American entertainment crew that came out here, and they wanted to take Ray back to America. But the New South Wales government wouldn't give him a passport.
Do this because I want you to compare the situation before 67 and what it is today. Now, for Ray to get a passport, he had to go to what was in New South Wales, the Aboriginal Welfare Board. So he went up to the board to get permission, and they said, well, what do you want, boy? He said, I want to apply for a passport. And they said, you don't need one. So Ray came and said, they won't give me permission to get a passport. And if you've heard the story before, please forgive me. But I said I had a friend whose name was Jim Healy, and he was the General Secretary of the Waterside Workers' Federation. And on one occasion he said to me, if ever you need a hand, just let me know. So I thought, well, I'll put this man to the test. So I went down to 66 Sussex Street, and he's sitting at his desk, and he said, come in, and I went in. And he said, what can I do for you? So I told him that Ray had been refused permission to apply for a passport. And so Jim sat there, and he took his pipe out and he tapped it on his boot, and he said, you go back up there to Bridge Street and you tell the Aboriginal Welfare Board that when Ray gets his passport, the boat will sail. And in my innocence and as game as Ned Kelly, I just walked straight up Bridge Street, and I went into the Aboriginal Welfare Board, and I told them, you know, you've refused this man permission to get a passport. I've got a message for you from so-and-so. And he said, the boat will sail when Ray gets his passport. Well, I'm happy to say that Ray got his passport in a very short time. But I tell you that to give you an idea how the Aboriginal people were controlled in this state of New South Wales.
My name's Jan Woodard, you're watching Coffee Break, and today for International Women's Day I'm honouring feisty feminist women who've had an influence on my life, and one of them is Joan Bielski. Now, the influence that Joan had on Australian culture is quite extraordinary. Now, she was instrumental in the Commission on Women, early 70s, don't quote me on that. Joan Bielski and Josepha Sobski and other women were very, very influential in formulating the school curriculums in the early 1970s. So let's go to an interview with Joan Bielski where she tells us a little bit about her story.
On women speaking up, I would hope that all the women, when anybody tries to put them down, does what my grandmother did when she talked to Henry Parkes. Henry Parkes said, you look like a young woman who'd speak her mind. And she said to Henry, I do. And she probably, on the spot, she gave him what she thought of. I forget what she told me what it was. She did speak her mind. Sometimes her mind was a bit tough on other people. She was not known for her tact. And I understand I'm sometimes not known for my tact too. Ada Ward, that would be about 1895, 1900, when she was about 22 or 23. And that's my mother when she was about 30. That's me in the Air Force. that's when we were kids. I don't remember what age we were there. I think, and that's my brother and I in the Air Force. Achievements are never only your own. You do it, something I learned in the women's movement, you do it with other people. But I suppose the first thing was the book I wrote was part of a book called about women university graduates and what they did with their careers. This was way back in the 40s and 50s. So when the women's movement of the 70s came, I was read up on the subject. But I think the Royal Commission on Human Relationships, which I thought was groundbreaking, I think I wrote the first report on discrimination against women in Australia. Then I suppose my work with the Ministry of Education on women and girls' education in both schools, TAFE and universities. But also my voluntary work was, my activist work was being a founding member of WELL in New South Wales and a founding member of Women into Politics and a founding member of Women in Education, all of which were things dear to my heart. I think I grew up fairly independent person because I lost my parents very young, but my grandmother therefore was my mentor, and she was always interested in politics. She was a lousy housekeeper, it never interested her, and she taught politics when women didn't, and she brought me up on what Henry Parkes said to her and what she said to Henry Parkes, and also she told me a tale about how as the 1917 referendum on conscription, she had 4 sons, she had no intention of any of them going to that war, and she and her associates traced Premier Holman, who was Labor but pro-conscription, out of the Waverley Town Hall. They advanced on him with their umbrellas and he went out the back door. And she loved that story. But she was also a reflection of the sectarianism of the time. We grew up in country towns and were Catholics, and I remember as primary school on the school bus yelling out, Catholics ring the bell while the Protestants go to hell. I didn't know any better at that time. And I can remember when Chifley became Prime Minister, she was very pleased because he was Catholic. So I thought I'd prick her balloon and I said, yes, Grandma, but he was married in the Protestant church. And she straight away switched side and said, no good will come of that. But she talked politics, and my ward family all talked politics. And they had an interest in the arts and all sorts of things. So they were unusual, I think, probably for their times. And they were all very witty. So a conversation was good fun. And I think that's where I got the gift of the gab.